They're excited to get out of here. Holy cow. You got to speak a little louder, David, if you're going to chirp at me before we even start. Goodness. Stretch it out. We're going to be here a while. Now, this Tuesday, something very exciting coming up. I'm sure many of you are going to be handing out treats to little costume characters at your door. But certainly, I'm sure everybody has seen the aisles of snack-sized candy all through the aisles of the grocery store and the drugstores, right? Now, I never understood snack-sized candy because to me, all candy is snack-sized if you're dedicated. But nevertheless, one of the best candies this time of year, if the remote will work, is Starbursts. Those little chewy, fruity, taffy-like squares. Who like Starbursts? A few of you. Now, usually, this time of year, they come in a little pack of 2. And they can be fun to open and see what flavors you get. You might hit the jackpot and get 2 pink ones, or a pink one and a red one, or you might get stuck with 2 yellows, which is always the worst. But it's the best candy. Every time you have a Starburst candy, you can remember the book of Esther. Because Esther in Old Persian means star, and her Hebrew name Hadassah means myrtle or myrtle tree. And the myrtle tree was native to the Babylonians, and it put out a flower that kind of looks like a starburst. Not the candy, but an actual starburst out in space. Like the book of Ruth that we've looked at for the last few weeks, we see Esther's name right at the top of the page, because she is indeed the star character of the text. Now, certainly, as with all Scripture, God is really the main character, but within this narrative of Esther, she's at least the human star of the story. What I find very interesting throughout Scripture, and both Ruth and Esther illustrate this for us, is that at critical times in history, God raises up unique women to hear God's voice and pursue God's will. We see that with Ruth, and we see that with Esther. But we also see that with people like Deborah. She was one of the judges in Israel. There's also Lydia in the New Testament, the successful businesswoman in a male-dominated Roman Empire. Or Miriam, also from the Old Testament. She's a prophetess and an exceptional military leader. In critical times in history, God raises up unique women who hear God's voice and pursue God's will. Now, interestingly, though God is really at the center of the story of Esther, God's name does not appear to be present in the text. If you're taking notes, I want you to put a little asterisk there. God's name does not appear to be present in the text. If we have time, we'll revisit it. God is certainly not overtly mentioned in the book of Esther. There's also no direct reference to prayer or to faith or to the law of Moses. And the book of Esther is never quoted by any writer in the New Testament. It makes Esther a bit of a challenging book to fully grasp and understand. In fact, because of this, Martin Luther had once wished that the book of Esther had never been written. He was a little grumpy, though, so don't think too much about it. But though it's different in many ways from other stories of Scripture, and though there seems to be an absence of God, prayer, and faith, God is very present in the book. It's just not in the miraculous ways that we see in other parts of Scripture. We're used to the dramatic parting of the Red Seas or water from a rock. But here in Esther, we won't find any dramatic miracles of God. But we will certainly see God's providence on full display. Now, God's providence is different than a miracle. In providence, God is supernaturally working through the natural. Make sense? God takes the goings-on of normal, everyday life, those regular circumstances, and moves those things, as we read in Romans 8:28, all things work together for good. Or in Ephesians 1, where Paul said, God works all things according to the counsel of his will. So though we may not see God's name overtly in the book of Esther, God's fingerprints are all over it. Where there's a lot of value in the book of Esther is in its everydayness. It's God working through everyday, regular, normal life. So those of you who might be thinking, well, you just have an ordinary, average life, you've got a regular job, nothing too dramatic, this is the book for you. Because it's a story of a regular Jewish girl who encounters some struggles early in her life when her parents die. But then this girl gets elevated to the position of queen, but in a pagan kingdom. but we'll see that God has placed her there for a specific season and for a specific reason, though Esther doesn't know it until the story unfolds. But she will discover the will of God in her regular, everyday occurrences of life. What also makes the book of Esther very important for us is that without it, we wouldn't know what life was like for the Jews who were left behind in Babylon. Remember, they're taken captives by the Babylonians, right? And then eventually, the Babylonians are overtaken. And a decree goes back that the Jews can return to their homeland. The thing is, very few of them actually end up going back. Only about 50,000 or so go back to Jerusalem to rebuild. Over 1 million of them stay. Now, the scriptures already show us what life was like for those who went back to rebuild. We see that in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. But Esther's the only book in Scripture that gives us a little bit of insight as to what life was like for the Jews who stayed behind. Now, the book of Esther is very short. It's only a few pages. It's divided up into 10 chapters, so it's a pretty short book. For our purposes, over the next couple of weeks, we can divide it easily into 2 halves. The first half is all about a crisis anticipated. The first half is going to move along, bringing us to a crisis point in the story. And the second half of the book is all about how that crisis is overruled. First half, crisis anticipated. Second half, crisis overruled. Now, this week and next week, we're going to be in the crisis anticipated section of Esther, and then John's going to spend the next 2 weeks in the second half of the book. We'll see how the crisis is overruled. This week, we're going to focus on chapters 1 and chapters 2, and we'll see God's providence at work. It begins with this. This happened in the days of Ahasuerus, or Ahasuerus. Now, right off the bat, depending on what version, what translation of the Bible you're reading there, you might see a different name, either Ahasuerus or Xerxes. Can be a bit confusing. It's the exact same person. Xerxes is just the Greek name, or the Greek form of Ahasuerus, and it's much easier to say, so that's what we're going to call him for the next couple of weeks, okay? But it's the same person. We're going to pick up the pace, I promise, but I have to point this out to you. I'm wearing the Disney tie. You know I'm a big Disney fan. I have to point this out to you before we move on. Heitzig pointed it out. I have to share it with you. Ahasuerus means mighty or mighty man, or in the Akkadian language, it means lion. So we read here that his name means lion and he was the king. So technically, this is the first Lion King. It's true. Xerxes is no Mufasa, though, that's for sure, because Xerxes is famous for his temper. His mood could swing from one extreme to the next at the drop of a hat. We'll see that on display as we go through the book of Esther. Let me give you a couple other examples. At one point, Xerxes is given a huge sum of money towards the expense of a military expedition by a man by the name of Pythias. Now, Xerxes is so enraptured by Pythias' gift and his loyalty to the kingdom that he actually returns the money, and he gives Pythias a big, handsome gift along with it. Now, this man Pythias makes a simple request. He asks that one of his sons, the eldest, would be excluded from the military expedition. Pythias was getting old. He had some declining health. He wanted his son to be able to take care of him. Seems like a pretty reasonable request. Not to Xerxes. He goes crazy. He has the son cut in half and makes the army march between them. This is who we're dealing with here. At another point, Xerxes has a bridge built over a significant body of water. Just as the bridge is nearly complete, a big storm comes, and it destroys the bridge and some ships and some other things. Xerxes is furious. Now, it's a little unclear if he does this himself or if he orders somebody else to do it, but he has the sea whipped with 300 lashes. He's trying to punish the water for breaking his bridge. That's not enough for him, though. All the people who worked on the bridge, beheads them as well. Now, history records him as physically being the most beautiful, handsome, kingly-looking ruler, but morally and psychologically, he's just not all there. That's who we're dealing with here in the book of Esther. So we read there in up to verse 9 that Xerxes is throwing a huge party, all of the food, the drink, all of the fancy stuff for 6 months. For 6 months, he's displaying the wealth of his kingdom. He's having this huge party for himself, for his officials and ministers and other nobles. And you can see that governments have been wasting tax dollars since biblical times. This is taking place in the 3rd year of his reign. So we're in about 483 BCE here. And the reason for this big 6-month extravagant party is that he's trying to sell the nobles a war plan. See, there's another king on the rise at this time. His name is Philip of Macedon. And Xerxes wants to go to war to try to eliminate that Greek threat. But to do that, he's going to need a lot of money and a lot of support. So he's throwing this huge celebration. Let's pause for a moment. I told you the first half of the book was all about building to a crisis point, and we would see God's providence on display, God supernaturally working through the normal and everyday occurrences to accomplish God's will. But if we were to step outside of the book of Esther for a moment and look at this event through the lens of history, we can see God's providence. Philip is on the rise. The Greek Empire is becoming stronger. Philip is going to have a son named Alexander, and people are going to think that he's pretty great. And Alexander the Great is going to go on to take over the entire world. So the first world-governing empire is Babylon, and then here in the book of Esther, it's Persia, and then it will be the Greeks. As they do this, pockets of Greek culture will spread all over the world. And Alexander the Great will build a road system that will later be expanded on by the Romans, so that by the time of Jesus in the New Testament, the world speaks a common language, and the gospel can literally travel all around the world on a road system built by the Greeks. So even here, we see the shades of how God is setting the scene, moving the pieces around perfectly for the New Testament to happen. We read in Galatians 4:4. But when the set time had fully come, God sent his son, born of a woman, born under the law. When the set time had fully come, or in the fullness of time, when the time was just right, that's when Jesus shows up. But God had been at work, arranging the pieces so that everything would line up just the way it needed to. But back to the book of Esther. For 6 months, Xerxes has this party. He follows up that party with another party. That one just lasts a week. It's to thank all of the palace officials who put on the first big party. We read there in verse 9, Queen Vashti was also giving a banquet for the women as well. Social custom is why the men and women would have been separated. And we read in verse 10 and 11 that on the 7th day of this party, once the king was merry with wine, he commands that the queen be brought in so that he can show her off to his guests. Vashti was beautiful. Xerxes wants to show her off, kind of like a trophy wife. But verse 12, Vashti refuses. The guy that beat the water because it washed out his bridge, the guy with the famous temper, is refused by his wife. Xerxes doesn't take that very well. Maybe a bit surprising here, he doesn't actually rush to action. First, he consults with his staff and his sages. And the idea that a woman would say no to her husband, especially when that husband was the king, was something they never would have had to deal with before. So at first, they're a little bit perplexed as to what to do. They conclude that not only was her refusal wrong to the king, but also disrespectful to the partygoers. But the real problem for them could be that other women in the kingdom might look to the queen and realize that they could refuse their husband's requests, and they couldn't have that. So they strip Vashti of her crown, and she's either banished or executed, though it doesn't say that here in the text. And then they send out a royal decree that women, you better obey and honor your husbands. So they do that. And then something really significant happens in chapters 1 and chapters 2. But it's not recorded in the Bible, but historically we know that there's a really significant battle called the Battle of Thermopylae. This is the battle that the movie 300 is based on. Anybody see that movie? Yep. Came out maybe 2006 or so. Essentially, Spartan King Leonidas, along with 300 Spartan warriors, take a stand at Thermopylae. That means hot gates. The Persians at this time, they're just sweeping across the land. They're decimating everything. And they expect that that's going to continue. Xerxes is not even expecting that there's going to be a battle. He sends a messenger when they arrive to the Spartans. He tells the Spartans, just lay down your weapons, okay? Move out of the way. We don't have to have a fight. Lay down your weapons. And famously, Leonidas is historically recorded as having responded with, lay down our weapons, come and take them, which is the coolest thing ever. As you can imagine, Xerxes does not take this well. He's infuriated. Now, as good as the Spartan troops are, they know that all of them are going to die in this battle. Their goal is not to win the war here. Their goal is really just to slow the Persians down long enough to give the other armies of Greece time to get organized and get ready for this invasion. Now, the movie is accurate in the sense that despite being enormously outnumbered, we're talking thousands to one here, the 300 Spartans are able to inflict massive damage to the mighty Persian army, and they actually hold the hot gates for a few days. They're able to do this for a couple of reasons. First, the Spartans were the best warriors of their time. The Persians had huge numbers, but they weren't trained very well. So there's a significant skill advantage. The other thing is that the Spartans chose the perfect spot to take a stand. The hot gates came to a point where it was very narrow, only about 20 to 100 meters wide. So though the Persians have way more troops, there just isn't the room for them to outflank or surround the Spartans. So wave after wave, the Spartans are able to hold their ground and push the Persians back. Now something happens during the battle, which is important for our purposes. While Leonidas commands his troops and fights alongside them, Xerxes wasn't that kind of king. He's not going to get his hands dirty. Xerxes is sitting in a gold throne up above, watching the battlefield. And at one point, he gets so enraged by what he's seeing, he gets out of his throne and essentially throws a temper tantrum. Now, he's supposed to be looked at by his people as a god king, and yet there he was acting like a petulant child. Things are not going well for Xerxes between chapters 1 and chapters 2. Now, eventually, the numbers game is going to catch up with the Spartans, and the Persians are going to win, but they suffer considerable losses. So though technically Xerxes and his army win, they go home licking their wounds, very low in spirits. So that's what's happened between chapter 1 and chapter 2. Chapter 2 then opens with, later, when King Xerxes' fury had subsided, he remembered Vashti and what she had done and what he had decreed about her. So he's already feeling low. And now he comes home and he's missing his wife. He misses his woman. He misses his queen. The servants want to cheer him up, so they suggest there in verse 2, let beautiful young virgins be sought out for the king. Basically, they're going to have a Miss America pageant so that Xerxes can pick a new queen. That's the plan. Well, Mordecai hears about this, and he's Esther's cousin. But when her parents died, it says in verse 7, Mordecai adopted her as his own daughter. So he hears about this search for a new queen and thinks, okay, this is a great idea. I'll have Esther enter this beauty contest. And here's where things are going to get a little bit sticky. Mordecai is Jewish. Esther is Jewish. So if she wins and becomes queen, she has to marry Xerxes, a pagan, which according to the law of Moses would be forbidden. So we find that, for example, in Leviticus chapter 7. It says, you're not to marry pagans or to give your children over to be married. And Leviticus 7 verse 4 gives us the reason. For they, pagan spouses, will turn your children away from following me to serve other gods. So best case scenario here, Esther will marry Xerxes, and doing so, she'll violate the law of Moses. Not a great option. If she doesn't become queen, she'll just be stuck living in the harem, and essentially she'll be an object that the king uses for his pleasure, and that's about it. So she's gathered up and she's given over to the king's attendants, but she does not reveal that she's Jewish. As we read in verse 10, Mordecai instructed her not to. Now here's the thing. Mordecai's not doing what God has commanded him to do. Mordecai is violating the law of Moses, and he's putting Esther at real risk here. And yet, God is still in control. God is moving behind the scenes. God is lining up everything just the way it needs to be. Now we see in the text there that Esther was very beautiful. And she seems to have a good personality and is very likable, from the way that she wins favor with the attendants and the way she seems to carry herself. Outside of the Bible, the historian Josephus wrote that Esther surpassed all women in beauty in the entire habitable world. Josephus is writing during the time of Christ, so he can't know this to be a fact for himself, but certainly the stories and the folklore of Esther's beauty must have spread. So she's beautiful, and beyond that, she seems to have a very good personality. Now, each girl, after a period of 12 months of special cosmetic treatments, as we read in verse 12, are taken to the king in turn. If you would like to think that it's just a nice meet and greet with the king, a cute get to know you over a cup of Persian coffee, I'm not going to burst your innocent bubble today. In any case, verse 17, the king loved Esther more than all the other women. and Xerxes makes her queen, and he throws another party. But notice how much time has passed. The banquet in chapter 1, we're told, takes place in the 3rd year of his reign, and here in chapter 2, it's the 7th year of his reign. So in a page and a half, we've jumped 4 years. Now, certainly it seems like because of Esther's new position, her cousin dad Mordecai finds himself with a bit of a promotion, because we read that he's now sitting at the king's gate. So he's likely now a judge in the royal court. So Esther is exactly where she needs to be. And that results in getting Mordecai exactly where he needs to be. Because of his position, Mordecai hears about a plot to murder Xerxes. Mordecai tells Esther, Esther tells Xerxes. The matter gets investigated, and the folks who were plotting against Xerxes are killed. Now, for his trouble, Mordecai is not rewarded yet. And that's the key word, yet. That's where God's providence is going to come into play again. Mordecai will be rewarded, but not yet. In the fullness of time, when the time is right, but not yet. There's many of you who work really hard here at the church to make things happen. And I know many of you are out there living the right way. You're doing the right things. You're looking out for others. But maybe sometimes it feels like you go unnoticed or you go unappreciated. Don't take my word for it. Look at Scripture. You will be rewarded. You may not be recognized or noticed in any great fashion on this side of eternity, but you will be rewarded. Just as Jesus said in Matthew 6, lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven. So Mordecai, he uncovers this plot. In doing so, he potentially saves the king's life, but nothing seems to happen. He's not rewarded. The events get recorded in the official records of the king, but that's it, at least for now. Now, the book of Esther as a whole is ultimately just an invitation to look for God's activity. We saw earlier how God arranged the pieces so that the timing would be perfect for when Christ arrived. And here the pieces have been arranged just the way that they need to be, because the crisis is coming. The problem is coming. And how does God address the problem? Through providence. Through normal, everyday life, God is working things out. When there is a problem, God answers the problem with providence. We'll see it over the coming weeks as the story unfolds here in Esther. But let's consider a few other examples. Problem. How do you get a Jewish couple who lives in Nazareth to go to Bethlehem? And they have to be in Bethlehem because prophecy says that Messiah will be born there. That's a bit of a problem. How does God solve it? Providence. God stirs the heart of the king to make the people go back to their ancestral towns to be registered. Everyday events, everyday circumstances. And Mary and Joseph end up exactly where they need to be. Problem. How do you get a preacher to the heart of the Roman Empire so that the gospel can spread from Rome outward to the rest of the world and have him speak directly to the ruler? Providence. Have the preacher be born a Jew, but also as a Roman citizen. That way, he has the right to appeal to Caesar, which he does. He gets put on a prison ship and sent to Rome. Everyday occurrences, through everyday circumstances, Paul ends up exactly where he needs to be. Problem. How can you get the Jewish people protected during a time of a famine so that they'll be kept alive, so that they can eventually grow and then inherit their own land? Providence. Have a boy named Joseph sold as a slave to Potiphar. Have him be able to interpret dreams, specifically interpreting dreams for the king, which will make him second in command. Everyday occurrences, everyday circumstances, the problem is solved through providence. Providence. It's the overruling hand of God that works supernaturally through the natural. We read in Proverbs 19:21, many are the plans in a person's heart, but it is the Lord's purpose that prevails. Just think of the event of the cross for a moment. Judas, Herod, Pilate, the soldiers, the crowds of Jews cheering for Jesus to be executed. Their intentions are evil. Their intentions are self-serving. We got to execute this guy because he's causing us problems. Or we got to kill him because we don't like what he says. Or we got to kill him because that might make peace in the kingdom. That's their plans. That's their purposes. And they carry it out for their reasons. Everyday, regular occurrences. But yet providence overrules it. And the greatest thing the world has ever seen and known comes out because of the crucifixion. God is in control. We spoke a few months ago addressing the question, why doesn't God answer your prayers? This is all connected to providence. If you missed it, go back online and take a look at it. God is in control. And just a few weeks ago at Thanksgiving, we talked about that the key to Thanksgiving was to view our reality through the lens of God's sovereignty. God is in control. You see the news, the wars, the hatred, the mistreatment of others. You see people struggling with their health or grieving the loss of a loved one or struggling to put food on the table. Know this, God's loving, caring, protecting providence is all over you. The fingerprints of God's activity are all over the book of Esther. We don't have time for me to get into it today, but believe it or not, God's name actually does appear a number of times in the book of Esther, if you look for it. God's providence is all over you. God's fingerprints is all over your life. You just have to look for it. I'm going to leave you with 2 questions to ponder over lunch today. Question 1, can you recall a situation in your life where you were struggling, where maybe you felt like God wasn't listening to you or wasn't there, but now looking back today, God's providence at work? Question 2, do you trust God enough to know that even through the struggles and the pain you may encounter today, God's providence is all over you? Next week, we're going to reach a crisis point in the book of Esther, and we'll see that this providence doesn't make us lazy or apathetic, but that we respond to this providence with energetic opposition to sin. But for now, we're going to have Rick come and close us off today.